Hi, everyone. Thank you for joining me today and welcome. Happy International Women's Day, the day each year when we reflect on how far we've come and how far we still have to go, acknowledging a whole range of contemporary challenges that women are facing. But before I get into some of that and how it intersects with the climate crisis, I wanted to acknowledge country. I'm joining you from the land of the Wurundjeri people of the Kulin Nation, and I want to acknowledge their elders past, present and emerging, acknowledge that sovereignty was never ceded and extend that respect to Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people who are joining us today and to First Nations people around the world, including our Pacific neighbours who are obviously so impacted by the climate crisis. I also wanted to acknowledge the really critical role that First Nations people, particularly First Nations women, are playing in tackling the climate crisis in so many ways. There's seems to me to have been a proliferation of activists coming out with new First Nations organisations like Original Power, Seed in the last 10 or 15 years that have been enormously effective in their advocacy work on climate change. So I'm Amanda McKenzie. I'm the founder and CEO of the Climate Council. And as I mentioned, today's International Women's Day, and we are celebrating the special role that women play, whether it's socially, economically, culturally, the political achievements of women, but it is also a strong call for action for accelerating women's equality. So as we all know, we're certainly not there yet. And what we wanted to do at the Climate Council was profile 4 women in the climate space who we think are doing amazing work. And as you probably know, women are disproportionately impacted by the climate crisis, with its impacts hitting those in the developing world, vulnerable countries the hardest, but also vulnerable people in our own community the hardest. And those who have contributed the least to the climate crisis are sadly those that will likely already suffer and suffer in the future from those consequences most profoundly. And in a warming world, women face greater vulnerability to gender-based violence, to higher rates of mortality and injury when climate disasters strike, and less access to relief and assistance and healthcare in the aftermath. And we'll go into some of those issues during this presentation. And the impacts of climate change exacerbate a whole range of those inequities that women experience day to day, whether it's political, social, economic. So the climate crisis is a women's issue, as well as being an issue that intersects in so many other social justice issues. But on the other hand, women are paving the way for a cleaner, more just, safer future, with women on the front line. As I mentioned, First Nations women are doing amazing work, and women right around the world are leading the fight on climate action. So in this afternoon session, we're going to explore how women are impacted by the climate crisis and how women are leading in emergencies, and then how women can benefit from the clean energy transition. So before I introduce the panel, we're going to hear from Sabine Gorms, who's a Senior Manager of Program Delivery Unit from CARE Australia. She's going to deliver our opening address, Women Lead in Emergencies, on their Women Lead in Emergencies program. And the program aims to support women's participation in and leadership in crisis, and improve the accountability, inclusivity, and ultimately the effectiveness of humanitarian responses. So this is so critical in an environment where, of course, the climate crisis is making extreme weather events worse. And it's so relevant in our region, where we're seeing some of these disasters will of course happen more frequently and more severely, but we're also seeing it have this very detrimental role in women's equality. So Sabine, I'm going to invite you now to jump in and give that opening address for us.
Thank you, Amanda. I'm incredibly honoured to be here with you all to discuss the often overlooked ways that climate change disproportionately affects women. As Amanda said, I lead CARE Australia's program delivery unit that works closely with our country offices in the Pacific, who are at the forefront of our mission to support women to defeat poverty and achieve climate justice. While we'll mostly hear about the Australian context today, I'd like to take you to Vanuatu right now. As I was preparing for this address, I had a script ready to go, but the events of last week shifted that. As many of you would know, Vanuatu recently experienced a series of devastating cyclones and earthquakes. What we've heard since then is that 80% of the population have been affected by the cyclones, which brought floods, landslides, and extreme winds. Thousands have been forced from their homes, and buildings and crops have been destroyed. In addition to this, the care office in Vanuatu has been completely destroyed. The destruction brings home once again the devastating effects of the climate crisis and the unique challenges involved with delivering our work in the Pacific. As I open this webinar, my thoughts remain with those in Vanuatu who have once again lost everything, and with my Ni Vanuatu colleagues in this difficult time. The rolling cycle of disasters is the stark reality of climate change in Vanuatu and the broader Pacific. It's happening now. It's predicted that climate change will push an additional 132 million people into poverty by 2030. Those living in poverty usually don't have insurance or broader savings to help rebuild their lives from scratch when disasters strike, or to immediately adapt to the ongoing changes to the climate happening around them. And often, those without the financial security required to rebuild their lives after an emergency are women. Women are often tasked with producing food and collecting water. So when resources become scarce, the burden to find more falls upon them. Many women will walk for days to find water or forego food in order for their families to have enough to eat. We know that the climate crisis is not gender neutral. Women and girls experience the greatest impacts of climate change-driven disasters. They amplify existing gender inequalities and pose unique threats to their livelihoods, health, and safety. The reasons women are more affected by these disasters are the same reasons that women are disadvantaged in so many other ways. They are excluded from accessing resources and making decisions that affect their lives. For women, the risk of violence, exploitation, and abuse is especially heightened during disasters. Girls are also more likely to be forced to drop out of school to help care for their family members, where boys are not. Some girls are even forced into early marriage to help their families get through a crisis. Climate change risks are also more acute for Indigenous women and girls, women of colour, older women, women and girls with disabilities, migrant women, and those living in rural, remote, and conflict and disaster-prone areas. CARE, along with our partners, have strived for decades to fight poverty and injustice, but we realise that efforts to promote sustainable development will amount to nothing unless the world tackles climate change, with women at the centre of decision-making. Women like Margaret. Margaret's village at the base of Mount Yasser in Vanuatu once looked like something you'd find on a postcard. But Margaret and her family live in the shadow of an active volcano, which has erupted every year since 2015. They are still rebuilding their homes after the devastation of Cyclone Harold in 2020. It's been crisis after crisis for Margaret and her community for the better half of a decade, and the disasters keep on coming. Just as in Australia, women and girls are impacted in ways that often go overlooked, and too often they're excluded from the decisions about how their communities prepare for and respond to climate disasters. But with the right interventions, they are having their voices heard and leading their communities through climate shocks. Determined to do what she could to help her community cope with these relentless disasters, Margaret decided to attend CARE's Community Disaster Committee training. During training, Margaret and the other community volunteers learnt how to build cyclone-proof houses. They ran simulations on what to do when early warning alerts are issued by the National Disaster Management Office. They were trained in how to use and manage and maintain emergency equipment, and they learnt about the importance of having all voices from the community heard. Women have a human right to participate in the public and political life of their community and country, but it's a right that's often denied, especially in emergencies. When a woman is listened to, she will speak not just for herself, but for others too. And when a woman is given the opportunity to lead in times of emergency, she will prioritise the needs of the most vulnerable. This saves lives. CARE has piloted tools and approaches which support shifting power and resources directly to women in communities affected by crisis. The result of these pilots is the Women Lead in Emergencies approach. It enables women's groups to lead public discussions and decision-making efforts in their communities. Often, when you speak to men in communities in which we work and ask what community priorities are, the emphasis is on economic development and infrastructure. While these issues are important, when you speak to women, the priorities often pivot to other critical issues like accessible healthcare and schools. We know that there are differences here, but the key takeaway is that we have to get the balance right. Unfortunately, as many here will know, many of the organisation's political positions and spaces where decisions on how to respond to crises are heavily dominated by men across the Asia-Pacific region, and including here in Australia. Whilst women and girls are more severely affected by crises like climate change-driven natural disasters, they are still being marginalised in preparation and response. Women need to occupy at least half of the chairs at the table so they can advocate for solutions that best meet their experience. All of these Women Lead in Emergencies projects engage men in gender equality training too. Working with men to challenge and change harmful behaviour and attitudes is essential to transforming this system that often limits the participation of women. And the approach is working. Findings from a review of 813 Women Lead in Emergencies groups in 2021 demonstrated that this approach effectively prepares women to participate and lead. As one group member shared, we used to be ashamed to speak in front of the men. Now we are not afraid to defend ourselves when a decision does not suit us. We will say it out loud because we know the ways and means to claim our rights. In communities in which this program operates, we have consistently had community members, including men and community leaders, recognising the contribution women were making and increasingly calling upon them to participate. Women's equal participation and leadership should be encouraged at all levels of responding to climate change. Through women having voice and agency, we have seen countless examples of where they have taken transformative action. In some cases, this has impacted the lives of thousands living within their communities and further afield. Sadly, during the two enormous cyclones in the last week in Vanuatu, 11 people lost their lives. But this is a relatively small number given the intensity of the storms, which is testament to the value of early warning systems and good preparation. Just as in Australia, where locals in rural areas volunteer for the CFA or SES, a lot of disaster preparation work in Vanuatu is done at the grassroots level. Sandra Silas is a resilience team leader at CARE in Vanuatu, and she has shared with our team some of the work of the Ni Vanuatu women preparing communities for the impacts of climate change. Sandra talks about a nature island where children could not attend school some days because the school is across the river and it's often flooded. The leader of the community disaster climate change committee, a woman, has instigated the building of a bridge so that the children, future leaders of this village, can get their education even if there has been heavy rain. And there are countless more examples of this kind of leadership by Ni Vanuatu women who are putting the needs of the whole community first and proposing solutions. As a global community, climate change is our greatest shared challenge. Like any challenge, it can exacerbate existing inequalities between men and women, between the haves and have-nots. Or, if approached the right way, it can provide opportunities to reshape societies for the better. So, on this International Women's Day, myself, my colleagues at CARE, and all those on this panel seek to continue the conversation on women leading in the climate justice space. I now hand over to Amanda and the wonderful panel assembled to take this conversation forward with you all today.
Thanks so much, Sabine. I think that was a brilliant presentation, and I think the climate crisis can seem somewhat abstract or remote, but you've made it real for us in how it affects women like Margaret, and articulating that the climate crisis is not gender neutral, that it manifests in different ways for different people, and more frequent and forceful disasters affects women more, it affects women disproportionately and puts gender equality backwards. So thank you on reflecting on those things. I'm now going to ask the panel a series of questions, and they'll be reflecting on some of the things Sabine has said, but we'll say goodbye to you now, Sabine, thank you so much for presenting and joining us. And please have a look in the chat. There's some comments there from Sabine's colleague, Iona, about that work that she's detailed, Women Lead in Emergencies, which seems just such a fantastic program in helping women to be empowered and put their voices forward and lead the action in responding to some of these disasters. So I'll start by now introducing each of our panelists and bringing them in with a question. So I'd start with Rikki Dank. She's a Gurindji and Wakaya person, a traditional owner and director of Gurindji for Country. Rikki's a registered nurse, runs a contemporary and traditional Indigenous Australian art gallery, and has attended 2 of the most recent UN climate conferences in Egypt and Glasgow. She's joining us from Dubai, and which very generously, given the time difference. And so I wanted to welcome you, Rikki, and ask you what message you have from decision makers in ensuring that future policy, climate policy, incorporates First Nations knowledge and solutions, and importantly, that of First Nations women.
Thank you, Amanda, and thank you to Climate Council for allowing me to speak with you all today. We appreciate it. I guess my message is for leaders currently in Australia is for them to realise that one, that they are putting their views on how society should be run onto us, particularly for my family, my nation. I've been lucky enough to come from Gurindji country, Maribana country, which is women's country, where women, particularly older women, get to make the decisions for their country and how our country is cared for. So taking into view and to account on how other people run and decide what's best for their country before making decisions on behalf of other people. And I also believe that it's really important to get to the local level as well, to speak to people locally about how things should be done. As we know, things in Sydney aren't necessarily going to work for things in Borroloola, because we've got a completely different demographic happening there. So that would be my message for our current leaders today.
Thank you. And thank you for sharing that perspective. And I think it's so important to recognise that First Nations people have lived sustainably on the continent for more than 65,000 years, skillfully managing the landscape and protecting country. And there is so much to learn. And one of the areas that we've profiled at the Climate Council over a number of years is traditional fire management, which was obviously became very interesting across Australia post the 2020 fires. Everyone wanted to talk about traditional fire management and fire stick farming, and it's great that there's this renewed interest, but sadly there's been such a gap for multiple centuries in ignoring that in critical knowledge in how we manage country. So I thought I'd go to you now, Rosemary. Rosemary Milkins, a former Deputy Commissioner and Deputy Chief Executive of Fire and Rescue New South Wales and member of Emergency Leaders for Climate Action. I wondered if you can reflect to us a bit about yourself and what motivates you to campaign for stronger climate action and better disaster preparedness as part of ELCA, but also just to reflect on what we've heard from the previous 2 panelists about how we ensure that we're bringing in all of this knowledge.
Thank you so much for that introduction, Amanda, and my respects to our 2 previous speakers. May also acknowledge our First Nations people, and I'm on Gurindji land. I'm an old creature. I'm a creature of being 40 years as a public servant. I spent about 20 years in education, 10 years in health. I then went to a really unusual place called Premier and Cabinet, where I dealt with workforce issues. And then I spent my last years working for Fire and Rescue New South Wales, one of the response agencies. And also I've been, as my last career was as Deputy Commissioner of Police. So I've actually been able to look at emergency services and issues from really two quite senior perspectives. I've always, you'll notice from where I've worked, that I've always been interested in people. And it's that focus on people and my concern for people that really has driven my career and really my continued interests. I'm still on a range of committees. I still do some work in the public sector. And I'm a proud public servant. I listened to the news yesterday about fat cat bureaucrats, and I find that really annoying because it disenfranchises some really strong leaders, particularly in these response areas, who do absolutely fantastic work every single day. One of the things about retiring, which for many of you will see so far away, is that you're actually liberated to be able to speak and to actually have a public profile. When you're a public servant, you can speak, and in fact you're in a very privileged position that you're able to influence government and ministers and people around you around policy and decision making and so on. And that's a very privileged position. But you're also constrained really by the policies and thoughts of the day. And when you've been in the public sector as long as I have, governments come and go and come and go. And you have to, in your own head, keep your own values and ethics strongly in mind, as well as trying to influence people really towards solutions that are community-based and for the good of all, not just the good of a few. So it's been wonderful to actually liberate myself from the constraints of my previous lives and be able to speak about lots of sorts of things. I am a member of ELCA, which is a group of ex-commissioners and deputy commissioners and assistant commissioners of emergency services across Australia. The driving force behind it is my old boss, Greg Mullins, who was the head of Fire and Rescue New South Wales for many, many years, and an extremely committed person, extremely worried about climate change and the impact of climate. And he really leads ELCA and other committed people around the cause of influencing government, particularly at all levels, to take the right sorts of action and to keep them honest when they do reviews and royal commissions and look at incidents and making sure that government is actually doing what it said it would do. So my experience in fire and rescue and police probably taught me quite a bit about disasters. I learned, for example, how professional and wonderful are our firefighters and volunteer people in the SES and all emergency services, and that really they often put their lives on the line, particularly in disaster environments. And we shouldn't forget that, and we shouldn't take it lightly. And of course, there's a problem, as we know in many agencies now, of continually getting volunteers that are willing to do that type of work. I also learned about weather. I remember vividly spending half an hour with Greg as he explained to me how grass cures, which, is not something you really think you need in life. But if you've read his marvellous recent work with colleagues about the risk of grass fires across New South Wales into the next 12 to 24 months, you'll understand that understanding about grass curing is an important and wonderful skill. I learned about operationalising emergency services and how they go about that, and it's a fantastic thing. And I also learned about trauma, and I also learned about death. And in having participated, for example, in coronial things, you actually learn that sometimes the community is ill prepared for the types of things that will happen. And emergency services can't always be there to assist. And that's really, I suppose, a lesson that many of us have still got to learn. So one of the things that I saw really up close and personal was you could see warming. We're getting more events and more difficult events. I learned about how fires now just burn so much stronger, develop their own weather patterns that are absolutely devastating. There is no sense that you can put them out or avoid the damage that they're going to do. I actually saw all sorts of things around climate change and the impact it has not only on our environment, but on our resilience, on how communities function. It's devastating to see continual floods and fires. And we've actually got a term now in emergency service called compounding disasters. I think particularly of the region of the North Coast, which in a very short period of time had drought, fire, COVID, flood, and now is facing fire again, all within a few years. So the concepts of the past, which was people recover and build again and we'll all be all right because it will go back the way it was, are just not true anymore. That is not how it is. And there are a lot of people that suffer over a really long time trying to put their lives back in place, and also for us to recover our infrastructure. So yes, I've seen the warming, I've seen the impact, and unfortunately I've also seen governments ignore the type of advice that they're given about this impending crisis. I feel that we have more assistance and support from the current federal government perhaps than in the past, and I feel optimistic about that. But there's still a long road to travel to get politicians and those people who are making decisions about resources and committing to climate change, to get them to do it strongly and to go about it the right way and to pursue it over time for the best thing for the community, not only in Australia but worldwide. Thank you.
Thanks, Rosemary. That was really interesting, and that issue about multiple disasters happening in such a short space of time for communities are certainly not prepared for what is already happening, let alone what is coming down the pipeline. And I think it connects back to what Sabine was telling us about this is true internationally, and particularly for communities that are vulnerable, that have the least capacity to adapt and prepare. So the responsibility of governments, like in wealthy countries like Australia in particular, is to think ahead and prepare, make sure that we understand what is coming down the pipeline, prepare our communities and those programs, our aid agencies, etc., for what is going to be occurring. But then also, of course, mitigate the problem, tackle climate change as effectively as possible, getting our pollution down, which does connect us in with our next speaker, Dr. Jennifer Rayner, who's the head of advocacy here at the Climate Council. And she's working very hard at the moment on a range of different policy mechanisms that are being discussed at a federal level to make them as strong as possible. Jen, can you tell us a little bit about yourself and why you're passionate about seeing better policies for women and girls in reference to the climate crisis?
Thanks, Amanda, and it's really nice to be here today. I'm actually joining you all from Federal Parliament House, where we are working very hard to try and deliver some great climate outcomes. So it's great to take a moment to be able to talk with you all. The work that I do at Climate Council is really solutions focused. So we've seen this fantastic shift in recent years in attitudes to climate action in Australia, and a growing understanding that it's urgent, important, and needs to happen now. And what that now means is that we need to be really focused on the solutions. How are we transforming our energy system? How are we changing how Australians move around? What are the industries of the future going to look like? And how do we make sure that they're here in Australia, where they can keep supporting the prosperity of our communities? And so, as Amanda says, we work across a whole range of areas trying to help the Parliament, help the government, and help communities come up with really strong solutions across those areas to transform Australia's economy and to work towards a much cleaner future. And I think that's what's really exciting about work on climate change, is that we are building a different future. We're thinking differently about how our economy and our society works. And that's obviously essential for driving down emissions really quickly this decade, but it's also a fantastic opportunity to build a more equitable and inclusive economy and society. Because if we take it all the way back to the Industrial Revolution, where all of this problem kicked off with harmful climate pollution, those are economic systems that have also been incredibly disadvantageous and incredibly restrictive for women. And so in rethinking how our economy and our community works, we also have this opportunity to think about how we make our systems more inclusive for women, how we get women in more places to have more of a say, and how we design systems that are going to be much lower emissions while being much more inclusive at the same time. That's what gets me out of bed in the morning, and I think it's such important and exciting work to be doing.
Thanks, Jen. Ricky, I'll come back to you. First Nations people have been dealt multiple blows by the fossil fuel industry, forced to suffer the direct impacts of mining on country. We've all seen the terrible news in recent years about destruction of sacred sites. And, you know, that's the most contemporary news is just that, just the most contemporary that has obviously happened for many, many years prior to that as well. There's countless incidents of forced displacement, and then having to cope, of course, with the devastating impacts of climate change too. Can you tell us a little bit about how your community has been impacted by the fossil fuel industry and how First Nations women are leading the charge to work to protect country?
Thank you. Yeah, so I mean, I'm not too sure if people actually know about Borroloola, but we also have MacArthur River Mine, which is one of the largest mines in Australia. And at the moment, my community and nearby nations are facing threats from fracking. So I guess for us, so fracking hasn't started yet in terms of production, but we know what happens in communities in Turtle Island, so-called North America. So we've seen that from research done that those communities they suffer from renal failure, kidney disease, liver disease, also cancer, and we're starting to see those cancers happen right throughout different age groups, ranging from the older generation now to children. Now to have that and know that this is potentially coming for my community, for my family, is actually really, really devastating. Also knowing that we are still 10 years behind in terms of the age gap where Aboriginal people are still dying 10 years younger. We still have rheumatic heart disease in a lot of communities, diabetes. So it's a double blow for us. Make no mistake, we are still fighting, and we will still continue to fight even when fracking has gone into full production. But we also are seeing the devastation of mining and what that destructive extractive process is like, and we're seeing it happen to our water sources with the poisons that are happening in the water. It's poisoning the fish. And there's a lot of studies now starting to come about with people in regards to mental health around climate change and watching your home and your community being destroyed. But there doesn't seem to be a lot of information or studies done on Indigenous peoples, and particularly traditional owners, when watching your sacred sites of 65,000 years being destroyed, or your home of 65,000 years being destroyed, and what that actually means for First Nations people. It hits really hard knowing that your family are going to be drinking that poisoned water, and that people are knowingly destroying your home and destroying your family's lives, and are willing to take the risk for the sake of profiting. When we know in fact in Australia at the moment, we don't have a gas shortage, and then we are in fact shipping 70% of our gas offshore simply for those companies to make a profit. So it's quite devastating.
Thank you, Ricky, for articulating that for us. And it's yeah, I think that's one of the things that probably doesn't get enough coverage in this conversation is just that the depth of feeling that comes from witnessing that destruction and from living with that destruction day to day. I know that we released a report on mental health and climate change last week and got a really interesting response from our community. And there's been quite a lot in the chat going on around this about the importance of compassionate leadership and empathy. And it seems like where it is just that profit lens, rather than having the broader lens about why does this matter? What are we doing as a society? And I think, as Jen said, when we're tackling such a big issue like climate change, we have the opportunity to say, can we do things differently? And I think one thing that has been coming up in discussions I've had recently is, there will need to be mining in for clean tech. But how do we do it better? How do we do it in ways that are respectful and make sure the right people are profiting? All of that sort of thing. So we might have time to come to that a little bit later, because I'd love your thoughts on that too. Rosemary, I just wanted to bring you in on that too, just kind of riffing off that idea of more empathic leadership. There's been quite a lot of chat in the webinar chat about this, how there is research that shows that women in positions of power help to make better decisions. And Sabine reflected this, that women in positions of power are thinking about the good of the all. And I wondered if you could reflect on that in emergency management and your 40 years in the public sector. What has changed for women in leadership in the sector, and what more needs to be done to bring more women leaders in and to support a more a leadership style that does encourage empathy? Because just having women doesn't necessarily encourage a broader style of leadership.
Yes, you're quite right. And I agree very much with what's being said about we need different forms of leadership and different ways of tackling these problems. I would say this, that over my 40 years, I have seen change and women leading in more positions. Women are quite strongly represented as leaders, for example, in education, healthcare, social services now. But of course, they've always been traditional areas of where women go for work, the nurturing types of or educative types of services. It's probably more difficult to find women in emergency services. And I'll just read you a couple of statistics. So, for example, in fire and rescue, where I used to, bear in mind, of course, that you didn't have firefighters until 1985. So you're talking about a fairly short history of women being involved in this. Doesn't mean they're not doing it in their community, but, to actually have jobs where they can get into positions of leadership. So at the moment, in New South Wales Fire and Rescue, only 10% of the permanent firefighters are actually women, and only 13% of those retained firefighters who usually work in the country are actually women. And when I started in fire and rescue some years back, there were no women in leadership positions at all. The highest leadership positions were station officers, which are like a sort of platoon or a shift leader. So there are no inspectors or anything like that. I'm pleased to say there are now, and it's taken a lot of work from a lot of people to be able to do that. But it's a slow growth. And same with police. We've got a female police commissioner now, and that's fantastic. But there's still not really sufficient representation of women in those agencies. The other issue that arises is really, and I could write a novel on leadership style and women in male-dominated emergency services. One of the key issues there is that sometimes women don't realise what they need to bring to that leadership role. And one of the things you need to bring to it is your feminine qualities. And by that, I don't mean you have to wear makeup. I mean, your qualities that as a human being make you feminine and female as opposed to male. And it is exactly as you said, Amanda, it is that feeling of compassion, that concern for a broader community. It's about diversity of thought that women bring to that. It's not purely that you've got women, it's that you've got diversity of thought, diversity of ideas, a broader, more inclusive representation. And it's not just, of course, about women, it's about every other sector, that a portion of people that are disadvantaged in those areas. And I would make some comment that, because I'm a historian, interestingly, by background, that there's a wonderful book, I need to show you it, by a historian called Mary Beard, which is about women and power. And her thesis, and I think, I buy into this, that we really live by a Western paradigm of leadership. The ancient Greeks and Romans, when you think about them standing on the podium speaking, you see a man in your mind's eye. Let's not think for a moment that it's a woman that's going to be standing there. And that paradigm has come all the way through our culture. I'd be interested in Ricky's comments about this too, but in our 2,000, 3,000 year culture, that Western paradigm permeates. And Mary Beard makes some really contemporary and quite shocking comments about what happens when women are leaders and the type of criticism that they take, and I think particularly of our ex-Prime Minister Julia Gillard, but other people such as herself, just putting forward their views. On social media, they get harassed, they get the most ghastly things said to them. So we're not in the position yet, even though we're speaking more and there's more women to be seen and add their leadership to the mix. It's a fraught space, really, and one that we've not succeeded in really establishing strongly. It's almost, something that will be perennial, but it's something that we have to get on with, which really segues me back to you, Amanda, and to Ricky, for example, is that we need to have a form of discourse now that is inclusive, quieter, more thoughtful, that brings some of the qualities that female and inclusive communities bring to that discussion, and less of the male paradigm. We need to bring our paradigm forward in a stronger way.
Mm. Thank you, Rosemary. There's a number of comments in the chat encouraging you to write that book. So it looks like you'd have some ready readers already. And I think that's really interesting, that point about how women tend to lead in somewhat of a different way, and what is the value of that, and how does it bring, what does it bring for us when we're tackling such a huge global challenge that intersects with almost every other issue on Earth. Jen, I'll come back to you now. While women are disproportionately affected by climate change, there's also huge opportunities for women to benefit. And we've been talking about women's leadership styles. I wonder if you can talk to us a bit more about the opportunities in climate solutions and the policy solutions that we need, how that affects women, and whether there are more opportunities for women to lead in this space.
Yeah, it's a great question. And I think one of the things that I do really notice when I'm doing the work that we do at the Climate Council in advocating with decision makers and with business and with industry is that in the sectors that we really focus on, because they're the ones that are going to have to transition the most to tackle the climate crisis, things like energy, transport and industry, those are still incredibly male-dominated industries. Like, it's very frequent that I might be the only woman in the room talking about how some of those industries are going to make that transition. So I think one massive opportunity, and something that we're keen to encourage and support younger women to think about, is being more active in those industries and putting the pressure on those industries to be more inclusive for young women, so that the perspectives and views of women are taken into account. Because if you think about a sector like transport, women's transport needs are incredibly different from men's. And so if we transition the transport sector in ways that work for men, it might be cleaner, but it won't be any more inclusive than it is today. So we really need those women's voices in each of those sectors in particular, talking about how we drive this transition forward. And those industries really need to have the acid put on them to have women involved. But I think there's also some really great opportunities and advantages for women from getting this transition right. And the one I particularly think about is clean energy. Because we know in the global south, for example, that access to energy and affordable clean energy is a huge problem for many women and many women-led households, and for women who are responsible for the work of the household that needs energy, like cooking and cleaning. And so access to affordable, cheap energy that is not going to make their family sick, like really high polluting stoves or gas, is a real benefit. And equally, we know that in Australia, if you are a single head of household, you are much more likely to be female. And so affordable, clean energy for people who are facing cost of living pressures is also a really strong benefit. And then I just want to mention one other thing, because it's a bit of a bugbear of mine when we talk about transitioning industries, and there's a lot of focus on the fact that industries like mining, manufacturing are male-dominated industries, and we say, what about the jobs for the blokes? And that's a really important conversation about what those industries do next. But it ignores the fact that there's often a female-centric ecosystem that sits around that in regional communities, for example. You know, it might be the blokes working at the mine, but you've got the women working at the hospital and teaching at the school and working in the shops. And if the industry goes in those communities, all of that female ecosystem around them goes as well. So transitioning communities to be strong and thriving in a green economy isn't just about what blokes do for work. It's about how we build strong, thriving communities where men and women have fantastic opportunities to keep being in the communities and places that they love, but have a really bright and prosperous future.
Thanks, Jen. It's such a good point to make around how we craft the solutions, who are the solutions for, and how do they actually manifest in the community. Yeah, I think about that for myself, and when I had young children in prams and other things, you know, your transport needs are very different depending on your stage of life, and it does your gender is one of those factors that needs to come into the mix, which goes really to that point that all the panelists have made about the critical nature of women's leadership and inclusion. And you know, at times needing to knock the door down to make sure that our voices are heard. I'm going to ask all our panelists one more question, but first I just wanted to play a video. We've had, in the spirit of International Women's Day, about wanting to be inspired and thinking about what we need to do next. What are the steps that we can take? We've asked 5 inspiring women, from doctors to those impacted by climate impacts, to tell us one thing they'd like to see women and girls achieve as we work to solve the climate crisis. So Jay, who's behind the scenes, is going to play that video for us all now.
I want to see the voice of women and girls included at all levels of disaster planning and recovery, because actually there are opportunities to tackle the climate crisis and build our disaster resilience at the same time. And women and girls are ready with ideas, innovations and solutions to these problems now.
As we work to solve the climate crisis, I want to see women and girls achieve equity when it comes to healthcare. As it stands, women and girls have poorer access to health services and are more likely to suffer from climate-related health impacts like food and water insecurity and displacement from natural disasters. This injustice is true both globally and in Australia, and is worse for women of colour. I want women to be in decision-making roles so that we can create the systems we need to look after each other and protect ourselves from the gendered inequity inherent in the climate crisis.
I would like women and girls to achieve the feminisation of the values with which we address the climate crisis. I would like us to feel fully the grief, the loss of biodiversity and beauty, and the capacity of this planet to sustain us. I'd like to see us working harmoniously and in community to enact the solutions that we already know exist for taking climate action.
And what I'd like to see as we work together to solve the climate crisis is I want to see the empowerment of women and girls through education, access to technology and leadership roles. Women have been substantially significant leaders and innovators of climate action and policy change. Investing in women and girls will benefit the health of the planet and future generations substantially.
You've got a voice, and it's really important that right now you know that and you use your voice, because it's our voices, all of us, that's going to make the difference on climate. So women, girls, speak up.
I love that message from Jo Dodds at the end, women and girls speak up. It's so critical. I think so often, and I think Rosemary mentioned this, the environment that is, particularly the online environment, that can create a lot of anonymous criticism, can make women step back, because often women are bearing the brunt of very vile attacks. But in this environment, it's just so important that women and girls are raising their voices. Ricky, I wanted to just come to you again. I think that what you said really struck a chord with myself and with the audience around the impacts that you and your community are seeing from fossil fuel projects, and the risk of the risks from fracking, which are obviously so vast and have been seen, as you said, in other communities to be enormously detrimental. I wondered what you thought others can do to support the campaigns that your community is engaged in, what you're seeing as great solidarity opportunities. Thank you.
So I guess what others can do is for us, I would like people to really understand legislation around Aboriginal Land Rights Act, and also native title, because this is how we are seeing these mining companies, these fracking companies, have access to Aboriginal land. It's through all this different legislation. So one, for people to understand that. Two, I historically, for us, I've got family connections historically through the Gurindji people. We know we've got friends down in the south, as he said, in the cities and towns. And I would like and love for all of us to rekindle that friendship right across Australia, because we know now what happens, maybe in Burralula, when we've got destructive industries in Burralula, that's going to impact our climate, which is going to impact people, down south, in Naarm, Melbourne, Meanjin. We know that this will happen. Fracking on the Beetaloo will increase Australia's carbon emissions by 20%. So we know that this is going to impact also our Pacific Island nation neighbours as well. So I guess people start taking a stronger stance on what's happening, and with legislation, with governments, be aware of how that's going to impact each other, and when it comes to voting, make sure that you are aware of who you're voting for and what you're voting for. We can't just be blindly following a political party because our mothers and fathers have followed and voted for that political party for years. But also listen to people. Historically too, I think we have this romanticism, or this romantic idea of what a traditional owner looks and sounds like. We aren't those old Aboriginal men anymore. We are women, we are younger women, we are younger men. And I'm not saying that we shouldn't listen to our elders. Absolutely, we should listen and platform our elders. But we need to listen to all of those different community members and really take to heart what they are saying.
Thank you, Ricky. That's really powerful. Jen, I'm going to go to you now. There's a number of questions that have come in from our community that pose a similar question around what is the everyday actions that people can take? What are the things that our audience should be doing to engage more women in climate change action, to create a more livable future for generations to come?
I think there's so many great examples and opportunities for women to get involved in driving climate action. And I've been seeing names come up in the chat along here, I recognise, from women who are doing that out in their communities, in their organisations. And so thank you to all of you who are fighting that good fight. I think Climate Council offers lots of opportunities to get involved in our campaigns, whether that's to contact and speak to decision makers, to talk to colleagues and friends and family in your community about what's important, and to help drive solutions on the ground in your own communities. I think as well, the point that I was making before about there not being enough women in some of the spaces that are going to matter most is a really important one. So if you are a woman who works in transport, you work in industry, you work in the energy sector, really trying to engage with other women who might be in the sector in the future to show them the pathways that are there. It's a cliche, but there is that point, you can't be what you can't see. And at the moment, young women who are considering some of those sectors might just think that there's not a place for them in it. And it's really important that women understand that their voices are not only wanted, but really needed in some of those places. And so I know we've got a great diversity of women with impressive professional backgrounds in the Climate Council supporter base and probably on this call today. And I think one really practical thing that you could do is be talking to the young women in your lives about the opportunities in your industries and the opportunities to really drive change and build a better future that is both cleaner and more inclusive.
Thanks, Jen. That was really inspiring. It's so important for us to all think about what is that sphere of influence, if you like, around us, and how we can be using our voices to speak out and also to create that example that other younger women can see and feel inspired by too. I wanted to now go to all the panelists for a final question. So if there's one thing you'd like to see women and girls achieve as we work to solve the climate crisis, what would it be? What's your sort of top line final thought for everyone listening today? Rosemary, I'll go to you first.
Yeah, my final thought would be that you still, after all this period of time, we have to avoid gender stereotyping. We have to empower our children, our grandchildren, to avoid that type of lack of inclusiveness in their lives. And then they will have authentic voices to be able to speak and to make a difference. If we don't practice it from the moment that someone's born, then really we're fighting a very difficult fight. As long as I see people buy pink clothes for girl babies and blue clothes for boy babies, I will never think the fight is done. So it starts there, it continues onwards, and it takes quite a bit to unpick that. So that's my advice. Watch the stereotyping, be inclusive, and then you have an authentic voice and you can speak really well. And your kids and grandkids do.
I love that. Jen, how about from you?
I want to know, as we fix the climate crisis, what a female-led energy system looks like. What is it like when women are solving different kinds of problems? What does a female-designed transport system look like? What is the future industries that women can come up with for Australia when we're backed and empowered and enabled to kind of visualise what that's going to look like? So I want to know how, and I'm excited about how different the world is going to look when it's both cleaner and more inclusive, because women have had much more of a say in designing the next phase of our prosperity.
Thanks, Jen. I love that. And Ricky, a final thought from you?
Oh, thank you. I guess I've been really, really lucky growing up where I've grown up because I come from women's country. So I've seen, women make really, really important decisions for their families, for their country. Where I grew up, there was no such thing as a man's job or a woman's job. If it needed to be done, it got done. So I guess what I would really love is and my daughters had that same opportunity growing up, seeing that there are no gender roles. If there's a job, you do it. So for other girls and for other young ladies, I would love for them to experience that and to grow up, and even for young men, for the younger boys that are growing up, to experience what that is, to know what that is, and to know that, you know, your gender shouldn't be putting you in a position of disadvantage.
Thank you, Ricky. Very wise words to end us on. And I sure would agree that our three panelists and our earlier speaker and all of the speakers on the video were really inspiring today. I'm taking a lot out of what they've said. I feel very uplifted, and taking away those themes about people are impacted now, women's leadership is critical, that justice is not a given, that we need to be pushing and striving if we're going to be ensuring that this transition to tackling the climate crisis is just. So thank you to everyone that's been watching today. It's been awesome to see your comments in the chat. Thank you for being part of it. As a community funded organisation, as you know, it's your support that makes things like this possible. We'll send you a recording of the webinar in case you missed any of it or you want to forward it on to your friends. And if you'd like to hear more from the Climate Council, go to our website. It's linked in the chat and you can get more involved with us. So happy International Women's Day. We hope you enjoyed the discussion and we look forward to seeing you again soon. Thank you. See you soon.